Hi, I'm G to the next level, and welcome to Growing Up Genesis, a new series in which I review every officially licensed game for the Sega Genesis in bite-sized form and give each game a rating of 1 to 5 Gs from A to Z. This is part 2 of the 32X's library from the letters P through Z, so if you haven't seen part 1 yet, you can catch up by clicking right up here or the link in the description. And of course, be sure to support the series by leaving a like and subscribing to the channel, as the full Sega Genesis A to Z will begin very soon, and you'll be ready for when it drops. So that being said, let's finish up the small yet sweet 32X library. Pitfall, the Mayan adventure. Activision's 16-bit entry in their legacy Pitfall franchise is a prime example of how to rejuvenate a classic. Bring in a well-known character, update the personality for a new audience, then place him in a modern side-scroller while retaining the charm of the original. It was a big success, so successful that it was ported to every console imaginable, including the 32X. While I respect what Activision did for Pitfall Harrier here, I was never blown away by this game. The Genesis and Sega CD versions looked and sound great, although the game feels like it's a little too zoomed in, and I don't like the slingshot effect that Harry does when you turn directions. Seriously, why do so many platformers do this? Unfortunately, the 32X version is one of the worst ports. For some reason, this version has a jerkier frame rate that not only screws with your eyes, but also affects the timing of your jumps, causing pitfalls to happen. Because of course we did. And lots of retreading through the cavernous levels over and over again. Not only that, the graphics on the 32X port aren't much better either. They seem even darker than the Genesis version. Hell, I even prefer the music of the Genesis version. I'll save my extended thoughts on the original Pitfall the Mayan adventure for the letter P in the Genesis A to Z. It's fun for sure, but the 32X port is sadly a cash grab. I was going to give it 3 Gs out of 5, but I have to take it down a notch for the unoptimized conversion. 2 Gs out of 5. Primal Rage. I've never been a fan of Primal Rage. Yes, I know, many people have nostalgia for it, but I've never liked how the game plays. So when the 32X version of the arcade game came out first, I thought, yeah, that makes sense. It was a big arcade hit, and Probe did an excellent job on the 32X port of Mortal Kombat 2. Unlike Mortal Kombat 2, the graphics don't look much better here. Sure, the characters are bigger, and they have more fluid animation, the backgrounds are a tad more vibrant, and there are more humans on the ground. Cool. And the music in the game was rearranged yet, but doesn't sound much better than the Genesis game. Not much of an upgrade here. So why can't I get into Primal Rage? Well, like I said, it's in how it plays. I love the concept and the character designs, especially Diablo and Talon, but I hate it when fighting games make you hold attack buttons while doing directional moves to perform a special attack. Like you gotta hold 2 or 3 buttons together and do a directional move while your character stands absolutely still, totally not leaving you wide open for an attack, right? And the finisher commands are just absurd. It's pure luck if you can pull one off. And before you ask, yes, you can still Wii on your enemies as Chaos in this version. No, I can never pull it off. Sorry. Again, I know this game has hardcore fans, but Primal Rage frustrates me greatly. There is so much creativity here that I absolutely love, but just like Brutal and Cosmic Carnage, it's wasted on a clunky fighting engine. Not even the die-hard fans need this slapdash port. 2 Gs out of 5. RBI Baseball 95. The RBI Baseball series has been around for a long time and was a personal favorite of mine as a kid. And just like the previous games in the series, RBI 95 is a smooth, easy to pick up arcade baseball game. The game looks and plays great. I especially like the new behind the batter view. It's very colorful and super detailed. However, if you're used to the overhead view of the previous RBI Baseball games, you'll need to adjust to the batting timing. No big deal though, you'll figure out eventually how to get more than line drives. There's lots of variety in the game modes too. Home Run Derby? Yep. Editing teams? You got it. There's also a stadium tour mode that lets you look at the stadium's outfields. That's kind of cool. I really like the defense practice mode, which puts a CPU batter at a tee and you can improve your outfielding skills. But probably the coolest feature is the Game Breakers mode, where you are put in specific situations such as getting a grand slam, winning a sudden death in the 9th inning, making a comeback against an already scored opponent, and you get a password system to save your progress. Very fun. Unfortunately, and I apologize if this sounds familiar, it's not much improved over the previous RBI games on Genesis. You know all those modes that I mentioned just now? Yeah, they're all in the previous RBI 94 on Genesis. The outfield graphics and audio are pretty much exactly like the previous games. The outfielding in RBI 95 moves much faster, but there's a noticeable drop in visual detail. I get it, it's a sports game, so you really shouldn't expect a whole lot, but other than the new batter view, not much of a visual upgrade. Other than that, I won't knock this game nearly as much as the other weak 32X upgrades because at least RBI Baseball 95 is a console exclusive. Yeah, real subtle message there, Tengen. Play Awesome Possum? That's cute. That's cute. Maybe later. If you're in the classic baseball games and have a 32X, be a good coach and put RBI Baseball 95 into your roster. It might not get you a home run in entertainment, but at least you'll get a triple play. 4 Gs out of 5. Sangokushi 4. The only Japanese exclusive 32X release, this war-themed strategy epic is Koei's 4th title in their long-running Sangokushi series of games, or as it's known in the West, Romance of the Three Kingdoms. It's a turn-based strategy series where you choose your empire, build it internally with your soldiers and town crew, gather resources, and conquer the lands across several different historical conflicts. Now, going into the Growing Up Genesis A to Z series, you'll notice that while I respect them, I'm not very much into Koei's war-themed strategy games. Sangokushi 4 is available in the West on multiple platforms like the Super Nintendo and the Saturn, but the 32X version never received a proper translation by either Sega or any fans. Since I can't read Japanese, and to be true to the Growing Up Genesis review format, Sangokushi 4 is unfortunately unreviewable for me. But in the spirit of the series, I at least want you to see it, as no games get skipped in our A to Z, even if it's unreviewable. However, when we do eventually, and hopefully, get to the Sega Saturn A to Z, we will review it in that console's library. Check back for that, but for now, let's move on to the next game. Shadow Squadron. Known as Stellar Assault outside the US, Shadow Squadron is a 3D space shooter, a genre that the 32X just couldn't get enough of. However, it stands above the others by adding a unique level of strategy that other space games on the 32X lack. Missions are simple. Take out the designated enemies, warships, and bases without dying or running out of energy, which acts as fuel. You choose one of 2 different ships. Feather 1, the blue ship, is faster, more agile, and can shoot lock-on missiles. The lock-on missiles work great, but they use ship energy, so use them wisely as they do not replenish until the mission is over. Feather 2, the red ship, is slower and less nimble but has a better shield and more energy. However, you only get partial energy replacement after each mission, unlike Feather 1. Instead of lock-on missiles, it has a charge cannon that wrecks nearly everything you aim at, but it also uses a large chunk of energy. Feather 2 not only brings in a 2-player co-op mode, but there's also a really cool autopilot mode, which turns the game into an on-rail shooter. This mode is fun, but you might want to tweak the cursor speed in the options until you find the speed that fits you best. You're in full control of the ship speed as you can roll in either directions as well. Shadow Squadron takes advantage of the Genesis 6-button controller and feels very intuitive. This kind of game would work so well with a joystick, so if you have a 6-button Genesis arcade stick, you might want to try it with this. But what I love most about Shadow Squadron is learning the intricacies of taking down warships. You attack them part by part, and each piece explodes with such a satisfying particle effect. Learning all the different strategies for each mission is so much fun. The presentation is excellent. Polygons may not be textured like in Darkside, but everything moves so smoothly here. Rushing past an enemy missile while taking down warships is so satisfying, especially with the excellent sound engineering. And getting a good view of a warship exploding after the magnificent final blow, awesome. The soundtrack is fantastic too. Doesn't really take much advantage of the 32X hardware, but the oddly relaxing yet well-composed music meshes so well with the tense action. The sound effects are just kind of there, but it didn't bother me too much. I guess really the only negative that I have is that sometimes there are dead spots in the space action, but the atmosphere is so good that I rarely felt that. Reminds me of an earlier version of Colony Wars on the PS1, and that is absolutely a good thing. Shame the Saturn sequel never got localized, but oh well. Shadow Squadron may not have wowed me as a kid since I was so gaga over Star Wars Arcade, but oh my, have those tables have turned. That's just how some games age, and Shadow Squadron has aged like a fine wine. I love this sleeper hit, and I urge you to check it out. 5 Gs out of 5. Slam City with Scotty Pippen. Yay, we're blessed with another digital pictures joint. And I have a question, who thought it'd be a good idea to turn Barkley's Shut Up and Jam into an FMV game?
That's a bad foursome. I tell you what, dominate the court, earn some real respect. You and me will play one-on-one. What do you say?
You want some of this? You got it.
So yeah, it's an FMV game where you're Ace, a street baller growing up in the mean alleys of some urban city, and you have to earn respect by beating various ballers in a game of one-on-one. And I think you know what to expect from Digital Pictures by now, an FMV game packed with 90s cheese and barely functional gameplay. Unlike Night Trap, which is menu-driven, and Corpse Killer being a mindless rail shooter, in Slam City you control, and I'm using that word very loosely, Ace as you try to make buckets, only for your shots to not work half the time. Then you try playing defense, and it mostly ends up with you just getting dunked on, or catch a rebound with hilariously pasted on green screen players trying to catch the ball. I just don't understand how to play this game. I guess timing is everything since there are no visible prompts to catch, kinda like Sega's Prize Fighter. But it seems like every time I do try to shoot, I either pump fake and get mocked for it, of course, or it immediately gets blocked. I try to rush in for a dunk, and Fingers here just smacks the ball away.
Yeah! The Fingers got you again!
I'm sure it's user error, but my point is that the game does a really poor job telling you how to play. Only a few times did I magically make a shot, and when I did, the dunks were ridiculous. Is this Slam City or the Harlem Globetrotters? Man, I wish it was the Harlem Globetrotters. And lose the match and get mocked by the rest of your court. Of course.
He went around you like a detour sign.
Man, I almost broke a sweat running points on you so fast. You got beat down bad, man.
And that brings me to the one redemption that this wreck of a game has, the ridiculous overacting. Unlike Digital Pictures' other efforts, the hammy acting in Slam City is pretty funny.
How's that one taste? Man, he went over you like a speed bump.
They look like they legitimately had a great time making this game, so I'll give it, respect for that. Maybe it's because of my own personal upbringing that it hits better than it should? I don't know. The taunts and reactions you see after the shots can be pretty hilarious too. Yes, the dialogue is absolutely cringe.
Girl, your feet must be tough.
Why you say that?
Cause you've been constantly running through my mind.
So yeah, the game is still garbage like any other Digital Pictures F&B game, but, you know, I can't completely dog it because I did have fun cringing at the acting. So yeah, I'll give it to Slam City. Its unintentional humor saved it from being tossed in the bin. Just barely, though. 2 G's out of 5.
You go, woof. You
What? Thank you, girlfriend, for me. $50 for my rent.
Space Harrier. We're all Sega fans here, so I think you know what Space Harrier is.
Welcome to the fantasy zone. Get ready.
And if you watched part 1 of this 32X A to Z, you might remember what I said about Afterburner Complete. So much of that applies to the 32X port of Space Harrier. It looks and sounds arcade accurate and plays great, but once again, it feels like a filler title for the 32X lineup. Now look, I don't want to take anything away from or disrespect Afterburner or Space Harrier. They are both iconic and I love them dearly, but I feel those resources would have been better spent elsewhere, or perhaps a 2-pack rather than standalone releases. I don't think they were strong enough to sell 32X units on their own. They are both still as much a blast to play now as they were back in their heyday, and the 32X Space Harrier is a much more significant jump in quality from the Genesis Space Harrier 2 than Afterburner was, so I'll give it credit for that. 3 G's out of 5. Star Trek Starfleet Academy Starship Bridge Simulator. Whoa, that's a mouthful. I want to apologize because I've never really been into Star Trek, but from what I gather, if you ever wanted to know what it feels like to be in the Starfleet Academy and control a starship, it's pretty faithful. You could be a male or female student as you interact with various areas of the Academy, tour the ship, talk to your classmates, get some food, and even play space pool. No, it's not as cool as Side Pocket, but I'd probably rather play that too. Arguably, the most excitement comes from controlling the starship and doing training simulations, including being a courier. Yeah, exciting, I know. There are combat missions too, but the controls feel overly clunky. The options during flight are extensive, but almost to a fault. Micromanagement is key here, and it's just not really my thing. I get it, Star Trek is more about story and less about combat, but there's a pretty high level of RPG elements here, which is something that the 32X lacks, so big respect points there. And the 3D models of the ships look good, even if I know next to nothing about Star Trek. If you're a Star Trek fan, I could see you enjoying this game. And if you have played it and you are a fan, let me know in the comments how faithful it is to the source material. Because as I mentioned, I just can't really get into it. But the game looks good and it plays fine, so I think it's fair to give it 3 G's out of 5. Yeah, I can't play the actual gameplay audio because I know the Disney will clap me, but hey, Star Wars Arcade! Oh man, there's a lot I could say about this one, so I'll try to keep it concise. As a Sega kid, Star Wars Arcade would be the first Star Wars game that I ever owned, and the sheer fact that I could finally pilot a ship in that universe in 3D blew my mind. The screaming sound of the TIE fighter zooming past you, the rush you get when you hit hyperspace, the sheer immersion as you storm the Death Star as Admiral Akbar briefs you on your missions, I loved all of that as a kid. Unfortunately, Star Wars Arcade has aged really poorly. Now, in all fairness, hold on, hear me out. I've never even seen the original 1993 Sega Star Wars arcade cabinet, so I'm not sure how faithful this 32X port is, but at least it adds more gameplay than the arcade version. There are 2 modes, the original arcade and an exclusive 32X enhanced version. The arcade mode is fine, but it's relentlessly hard, and since it's a port of the arcade game, even if you do get far, the game ends before you know it, and no, I've never beaten it. Multiplayer does make the arcade mode a bit more manageable, but it's still brutal once you get to the Star Destroyer. The 32X Enhanced mode adds new missions and balances out the difficulty, so while this is definitely the mode to play, all the standard
Wipe out enemy fighters.
Missions just drag on and on. You have your basic guns and photon missiles to attack, and you'll also need to learn the fine art of using your missiles wisely. They do recharge, but many times you'll waste missiles thinking that you've made a hit only for the enemy to fly off screen and it won't count, just because they've left your direct vision. That wasn't an issue in Shadow Squadron. The controls feel very stiff. It takes ages to turn in this game, and even when using the radar to track down your enemies, it's still tricky to catch up to them sometimes. You'll figure it out over time, but you'll fail often in the process. And I'm not sure if the original arcade game was this stiff, but I can't imagine it being this way. After a few rounds, multiple failed attempts at R2-D2 screaming every time you're near death, it's just not very fun. At least the game looks good. The deep space missions are kind of blah, with just your simple asteroids and your enemy fighters to take down, but the Death Star and Star Destroyer missions are a lot more interesting. They look really cool on the surface, with a huge amount of detail on the ships, but the frame rate takes a significant drop due to the sheer amount of enemy fire on the surface level, and especially suffers in the trenches of the ship. And oh man, the trenches. You're already too stiff to move around, and now you have to deal with narrow corridors, and enemy fire, and flying obstacles, all while the frame rate completely loses itself. It's a mess. Oh, and by the way, you only get a few lives, and that's it. This might be controversial, but I'd rather play the original Atari Star Wars arcade game any day, and that's not just my nostalgia talking. To me, it still holds up, and the 32X already has the aforementioned Shadow Squadron, which is a much better space shooter. I know people love it, but with its flaws and maddeningly high difficulty, it may be wise to leave the memories behind before trying it out now. I know the comments on this probably won't be fun, but sorry y'all, respectfully telling it like it is. 2 Gs out of 5. Supreme Warrior. The last Digital Pictures 32X release, thank goodness. Supreme Warrior is their take on classic martial arts films, and people who are familiar with that film genre may get excited seeing a familiar name in the credits. I'm talking about the Shaw Brothers, a legendary Hong Kong studio known for their classic martial arts films. With such a huge pedigree behind the development, will it save Supreme Warrior from being a supreme pain in the butt? Absolutely not. It's a one-on-one martial arts fighter that uses an engine similar to Sega's Prize Fighter on Sega CD. You can punch, block, and kick, but the success seemingly isn't based on countering your foes, but on timing your attacks with these tiny indicators on the side of the video. It's another Digital Pictures FMV joint that does a terrible job of explaining how to play the game. Being tossed into the deep end immediately and expecting to win is never fun in a game like this. If you're lucky, you'll connect with your attack and do some damage to your opponent, but they'll just pummel you into oblivion. Blocking seems pointless because it's a noticeable lag in the inputs and you can easily miss your prompt to attack if you're blocking, thus getting your butt kicked even more. And get KO'd and you'll be berated by your superior. What else would happen?
Learn to fear my men.
You fail because you fight criticism. Listen better.
It's yet another FMV game that's way too aggravating. As expected, it has cool fight choreography and it's nice and colorful, but the typical FMV cheese injected into the martial arts theme feels incredibly forced and super cringy. And unlike Slam City, it's cringe in the worst way. Another hard pass from Digital Pictures. Honestly, I can't think of one decent game that they've ever published. It's really making me afraid for when I get to the Sega CD A to Z because I guess we'll pass that bridge when it comes, but as for Digital Pictures' Action Kung Fu, yet another dang 1G out of 5.
My men are too fast for you, feeble one.
Surgical Strike. You all ready to see something wild? Here we go. This is the final CD game for the 32X, and it was a limited Brazilian exclusive from Tectoy, making legitimate copies super rare, a unicorn if there ever was one. A real shame that we didn't get one exclusive 32X CD game, all of them were Sega CD ports, and the Surgical Strike is easily the worst in the library. You pilot a dodgy-looking hovercraft armed with machine guns and rockets, taking out stereotypical foreign villains, blowing up tanks, destroying missiles, and yeah, everything explodes. Everything. El Viento would blush at how much everything explodes. And every time you do, you get interrupted by an out-of-place CG firing sequence. Then a quick cut to the enemies, comically flying out of the explosions, lather, rinse, repeat. It might be neat or even comical at first, but trust me, it gets old very quick. As you maneuver through 3 different areas to mindlessly take out targets, you'll soak in the dreadful acting, terrible green screening, and intentional cringe. They obviously tried to mask its low production values by being as schlocky as possible. It gets even worse in Stage 2, where you couldn't even be bothered to use people for the enemies and they just use plastic toy soldiers. Look at it, look at this again. Look how closely that is. It's something out of Action League now, but only without any charm. Oh, by the way, you can run out of ammo in this game, which kills you instantly. Great. There's a trap in the first stage where you think it's a target, but it's a questionable Easter egg that kills you instantly. Great. Wait, hold up. Did I just run over a bikini girl? Wow, game. All the sensory overload, aimless wandering around a confusing map, mindless blasting, failing missions only to be rewarded with, you guessed it, a berating from your superior. For frick's sake, I feel dumber after playing this game. Dumber and angrier. And I'm sorry, I really don't get this tilted talking about games, but this game just insulted my intelligence. Can't let that slide.
Mistake? You call that a mistake? The only mistake was making you a member of this team. But that's not going to happen again. You want to know why? Because in the morning, you're going to be facing a firing squad.
You have really disappointed me.
I'm normally against completed games not getting a full worldwide release, but honestly, Tectoy should have just let this game stay dead like the free 32X CD upgrade offered at Sega of America spaced on. You know what? Some of you are probably curious at the ending, so tell you what. Here, I'll do you a favor. I'll show you the Sega CD version's true ending to perfectly encapsulate this game's sheer insanity.
Okay, you win. So what? What are you going to do about it? Are you going to put me in prison? I will be out before you, and the UN can do anything about it.
Magnificent. I hate this game and everything about it. 1G out of 5.
You know what time it is. Yo, homie, Pippen! Tempo, check it out. You know, he makes it funky, and he's good to go. Oh, bang! Catch the groove with New York, LA, and San Francisco. The house tonight. You know it's gonna move your mind. The groove is out of sight. The groove is out of sight. As funky as you wanna be, Tempo's in the house tonight. Tempo's in the house. You know it's gonna move your mind. The groove is out of sight. The groove is out of sight. As funky as you wanna be.
You can't get much more 90s than Tempo. A colorful mascot type character that's oozing with attitude, lots of bright colors, dancing, random chaos everywhere, Tempo pretty much has it all. It's a music-themed platformer that I'd say is the most artistically stylish game on the 32X. It also reminds me a lot of Ristar on the Genesis, where it's not like super fast like Sonic. It encourages you to explore the stages, find notes, extend your health bar, and do dance numbers that will clear the screen of enemies. You'll also find your girlfriend, Katie, who is a huge help because she'll attack enemies for you once you stun them with your projectile notes. She especially comes in handy during boss fights. And the boss fights look great too. They're animated while still fitting in and still keeping into that CG look and feel. I love the entire aesthetic of this whole game. It's super colorful, very lively, the characters just have so much charisma. The backgrounds and even the foregrounds pulse to the music, and there's some crazy animated backdrops. It's a sensory feast and I love it, though I could see it being overwhelming for some. While the music, beyond the intro of course, doesn't seem to be making much use of the added 32X hardware, the super catchy melodies are extremely well done. I'd love to have this on a soundtrack CD if it ever existed. So if you haven't noticed by looking at the footage by now, this game is weird. Like, really weird. It's so psychedelic that you may just wonder what kind of supplements might have been consumed during development. You'll see oddities like this Marilyn Monroe looking bug in the window, walking hamburgers, and I have no clue what this is about. Now, as I mentioned before, Tempo's visuals might be a little overstimulating, but to me, that's just its charm. However, if you do have photosensitivity concerns, you may want to approach this game with caution, especially during a hi-fi performance level where the flashing background lights might be a bit disruptive. The only real issues that I have with the game are its somewhat slow pacing and the range of Tempo's kick attack. It doesn't connect all the time, and I found it's just easier to bounce on your enemies or make a sliding kick. And the last stage can be a bit frustrating, but still worth making your way through. Even with its flaws, Tempo is a mascot platformer that you definitely won't forget if you ever pick it up. I bet if Sega were to somehow bring him back in this current age of neon-laden insanity in games like Splatoon and Fall Guys, he may just get somewhere. Sound off in the comments if you want to see a Tempo comeback. You know dang sure I would. 4 Gs out of 5. T-Mek. When I first heard about T-Mek as a kid, I was pretty excited. It's a first-person arena combat game where you climb the ranks by destroying your enemies and racking up as many points as possible. You get this, a 2-player mode, and that's it. Not a lot of content here, but with a quick pace and multiplayer options, this has to be good, right? Well, no. Unfortunately, you'll notice the graphics are terrible. Everything is a blocky, pixelated mess, and the frame rate chugs to a crawl when there's too much action happening. From what I gather, T-Mek was kind of a visual underperformer in the arcade as well, but this is just gross. I have no idea what I'm looking at half the time, and in the cave arenas, the textures are even disgusting. Was the 32X even necessary for this game? Because I find it hard to believe that this is the best they could do. Look, here's Accolade's Zero Tolerance for the Genesis. Yes, the screen size is small and it's a bit pixelated, but the action is fairly consistent and I can see everything that's going on. That game still impresses me today, and most importantly, it's fun. So of course, since you can't really see half the time, the frame rate dips so harshly, the controls and gameplay will suffer as well. Sometimes your mechs are super responsive, sometimes they're sluggish. And the different mechs do have unique feels to their specs, so I'll give them points for that. But all of them have the same sluggish response, and it just kind of kills the flow of the game. If you try to play the game in split-screen multiplayer, everything falls apart and it's basically unplayable. So there goes the one thing that could have saved this game. I feel like maybe on some stronger hardware, if they took a little bit more time with this one, T-Mek actually probably could have been something special. Just like Star Wars Arcade, I never experienced this in the arcade myself, so I only have the 32X version to go by. And yes, it's a 32X exclusive, and it has a novel concept, but in execution, unfortunately, T-Mek is quite terrible. What a massive disappointment. 1G out of 5. Toughman Contest. Remember the rise of Toughman fighting in the 90s? Seemed like so many people were trying to make Butterbean a household name like George Foreman or Mike Tyson, and it didn't really stick, did it? So it's a boxing game that originated on the Genesis, but EA made a 32X upgrade as a US exclusive. It uses a wireframe behind the boxer view similar to the arcade Punch-Out or Sega's own Title Fight. I found the Genesis version of this game to be very bland and uninteresting, which the last thing a game about underground boxing should be is bland. No charm, no flash, just functional boxing. Even though some of the characters might be comical, you could tell EA was really gunning for that Punch-Out kind of vibe. But even calling it that is a stretch. One of the reasons why Punch-Out, Title Fight, and even Sega's own published Genesis boxing games are so good is because of how responsive they are and how you always feel like you're in control. Everything feels so clunky to perform in Toughman, and I swear that the few wins that I managed to get were by total fluke. The 32X version adds nothing new aside from slightly better colors, but removed a lot of the background's animations. This would be the only game that Electronic Arts would release on the 32X in America, so making a bland boxing game even more bland? Great job, EA. I really don't have much more to say about this aside from that it works, and I guess it's not terrible, but honestly, this could be the laziest of all the 32X upgrades. But hey, you can play as hip-hop sensation Coolio. That has to amount to something, right? 1G out of 5. Virtua Fighter. The arcade classic series made its way to the 32X after Sega unfortunately botched the original Sega Saturn home port, and they did this with a big marketing campaign and lots of fanfare. This might have been the most hyped release for the 32X after its early days. Plus, I just love that tagline, "Patience is a Virtua." Brilliant. Everything from the arcade game is here. All the characters, the stages, music, voices, everything. And it looks and sounds great. Of course, sacrifices had to be made for the 32X port, but AM2 did a fantastic job. The characters are animated smoothly and are much less glitchy than the original Saturn version. Sega even gave the 32X port a few extras, such as camera options, tournament modes, and a ranking mode as well. But most importantly, it plays excellently. It feels less floaty and more responsive than the original Saturn game. AM2 took their time to ensure this port's faithfulness, even if it was destined to be a commercial failure. I'm aware that Virtua Fighter is not for everyone. It's very much a love it or hate it fighting engine, especially the first game. But I've always been a fan. From the original release that blew my mind in the arcade to the outstanding Virtua Fighter 5, it's such a shame that Sega seems to have left this series in the past. But the 32X Virtua Fighter is proof that 3D arcade ports really could have been done on the 32X. An all-around excellent conversion that even managed to do things even better than its Saturn brethren. Big ups to AM2 for an incredible job on this port. It might be outdated and a little bit clunkier to play now, but I still want to give it all the credit for such an outstanding job of showing what the 32X could really do. 4Gs out of 5.
Racing!
Virtua Racing Deluxe. The first game in Sega's long line of Virtua arcade games, I will always have a soft spot for Virtua Racing. I fell in love with the Genesis version of the game during the 1994 Blockbuster Championships I competed in, mainly because I could never find an arcade cabinet until I was in college. So, like Virtua Fighter, the 32X rendition of Virtua Racing had to make some audio and visual sacrifices, but how it makes up for it is pure gold. AM2 did it again, folks, and they went above and beyond for VR Deluxe. First, the additional content. All 3 arcade courses are here, Big Forest, Bay Bridge, and Acropolis. But Deluxe adds 2 excellent new courses, Highland and Sand Park. Highland is a challenging course with lots of hairpin turns but has so much detail in its environments, while Sand Park is a much more open scape, virtually made for the 2 new types of cars in this game. So yeah, let's talk about those 2 new cars. Joining the standard Formula 1 racer from the original game are a new stock racing car and one called the Prototype. The Formula 1 racer feels exactly like the Virtua Racing original game, so it could be seen as the normal difficulty car. You can immediately tell how much smoother and faster Deluxe feels over the Genesis version. There's the stock car, and it's so much fun to drive. It's the slowest car out of the 3 and has the most drift in its turning, so it feels more like an easy mode. And then there's the Prototype car, which feels a lot more like an expert mode. It's much faster than the F1 racer, the grip is tighter, and you don't slide around as much, so you need to plan your turns with a lot more care. VR Deluxe's presentation rules. While the frame rate might not be as high as the arcade or even like the Switch Ages version, it's easily one of the best looking games in the 32X. The game looked excellent for its time, and has still aged well, in my opinion, pop-up and all. All the course details look so much better in Deluxe, even the bonus details like the word Sega and the grass, or the signs that you're zooming by, all of it looks so great. Well, maybe not the driver's view because it's still a mess, but everything else for sure. And then there's the music. While there isn't a lot of it, the tunes are so catchy and sound so much better than the Genesis original. Plus, that replay music. Gorgeous. Absolutely gorgeous. With the exception of the arcade or the Sega Ages Switch port, in my opinion, VR Deluxe is the best way to play Virtua Racing. The original Genesis game was good for its time, and I have my own nostalgia for it. But not only is the 32X version a great port, it is an excellent worthy upgrade. A big name for the early days of the 32X that every bit is a blast today as it was back in 1994. The best game on the 32X? Without a doubt. 5 Gs out of 5. World Series Baseball starring Deion Sanders. The Sega Sports World Series Baseball series lasted for a long while, from the Genesis to the original Xbox. Blue Sky Software spent so many years crafting a baseball series that's a fantastic blend of realism while keeping the action fast-paced. I enjoyed this series on the Genesis, but what did we get in the 32X edition to the series? Yeah, unfortunately, not much. The iconic digitized behind the batter view returns with a lot more color and vibrancy, and the 32X adds new camera zoom effects in the outfield, additional colors, and improved audio, well, except for the crowd noise that sounds like running water. All expected baseball modes are here. Exhibition, playoffs, season mode, home run derby, team edits, you get all that. Yet, like RBI 95, there aren't any modes for the 32X version that are exclusive. They're pretty much on the last World Series game for the Genesis. So say it with me, where's the upgrade? World Series Baseball 32X is solid and fun enough, but considering the game's absurd value now, there's no way I could recommend buying an actual cartridge unless you're going for a full 32X set. Or maybe if you're a big primetime Deion Sanders fan. I mean, heck, I did the touchdown dance when I was a kid. It's good. Like, very good. But it is also another fluff title in the 32X library. 3 Gs out of 5. Welcome everyone to Monday Night Raw! No one made this game so much better if there was actually a digitized sample of that in the game. So yeah, WWF Raw. We've already talked about the Genesis version of Raw in another YouTube video I've done, and it's roughly the same button-mashing retro wrestling game at its most bland as before. All the wrestlers have the same moveset aside from their finishers, and they even have super finishers, if you could even pull them off. The 32X version has slightly improved visuals and a bonus character in Savio Quang, the ninja. God, that was an awful gimmick. There are plenty of wrestlers to choose from, and I'll always think it's so cool that Luna Vachon was available to play, as most wrestling games at the time wouldn't let you choose a female wrestler. Other than this, it's the same old button mashing we all tolerated as a kid, but now it's nowhere near as fun. Your thumbs will cry foul after the end of each match, so you have to wonder if it's really worth the pain. If you think you were a fan of these types of wrestling games growing up, you might get some nostalgia out of Raw, but in the end, there's hardly any reason to choose the 32X version over the original. Much like the WWF New Generation, there's a few high points, but overall, nothing much to see here, and you'll probably groan when trying to experience it. 2 Gs out of 5. WWF Wrestlemania, the arcade game, unlike WWF Raw, isn't a button-mashing wrestling game, it's a button-mashing fighting game. Okay. In all seriousness, I actually love this game, like, dearly. It plays less like Raw and more like a Mortal Kombat game, or something like Mortal Kombat mixed with NBA Jam, but with wrestling? Right down to its button layout. Every character has over-the-top unique special moves for each character, like Undertaker using actual tombstones and projectile ghouls, Bam Bam Bigelow body slams his opponents in a fiery blaze, Shawn Michaels breaks out a quadruple sweet chin music, Razor Ramon uses razor blades in a wildly violent Alabama slam. Man, I freaking love Scott Hall. Rest in peace, Chico. And if you can get over the wacky, family-friendly, once again, new generation WWF vibe, and just like a fun versus brawler, I love the heck out of Wrestlemania the arcade game. I can't express the amount of hours I sunk into the arcade and eventually the Genesis version when it came home. The game does have multiplayer, but unfortunately it only has 2 arcade ladders for modes, so it's a little light on content. However, as fun as the original game is, how is the 32X version? Well, it has everything from the arcade game content-wise, unlike a certain not-so-Super Nintendo port that cut Yokozuna and Bam Bam Bigelow, but like Pitfall, it runs at a lower frame rate, so it feels less responsive than the Genesis original. Why? It's still fine, but that makes no sense. Aside from Mortal Kombat 2 and NBA Jam TE, all of Acclaim's 32X ports were either phoned in or dodgy at best. Real shame, because as much as I love Wrestlemania the arcade game as a whole, I can't give it the highest rating because of this weak conversion. But it's still worth checking out. If this is your only way of playing it, you still should play it. 3 Gs out of 5. Zaxxon's Motherbase 2000. Zaxxon, dang, that's a deep cut. While not the most well-known of Sega's arcade alumni, there was something so cool about Zaxxon. It was one of the earliest space shooters to simulate a 3D feel with an isometric view and various levels of elevation. But after the arcade hit, one sequel, and a few home ports, Sega just kinda left it behind. Until 1995, when Zaxxon's Motherbase 2000 landed on the 32X. Now let's be real, there aren't many similarities between this game and the original Zaxxon aside from the isometric view. In fact, the Zaxxon name is only on the US release. It's known as simply Motherbase in PAL areas and as Parasquad in Japan. So Sega took the game, slapped the Zaxxon name on it for brand recognition, and added 2000 to it. Because in those days, having 2000 in your name made you cool. Silly name aside, the game is a blast. It's similar to isometric shooters like Viewpoint on the Neo Geo, but there's a unique twist to this game, and that's the hacking mechanic. By jumping on top of most enemies, you can hijack and control them. Not only does it give you a few more hits depending on the size of the enemy, but you also learn its special ability to use as a secondary fire. It's really cool trying to figure out all the different weapons, all the different ships, how they control uniquely, and how which special weapon will work the best in most situations. After you hop out of that hijack ship, you'll keep that sub-weapon until you die or hijack another enemy. Once you grasp it, it's a ton of fun. I love this mechanic, and it kept me wanting to get further into the game. However, make sure that you watch how many hits you're taking, as it is different for each ship. If you see that bar flashing red, you are about to die. You better eject like you're playing a game of Steel Battalion. Zaxxon is quite challenging, but it's never discouraging. Also, the checkpoints are pretty generous, and you do get 9 continues, so it's manageable for sure. The presentation of this game is wild and ambitious. Lots of polygonal enemies with unique and crazy designs everywhere. Bosses are huge, often taking up most of the screen, and are pretty impressive, like in the asteroid field in Stage 3, and the water effects in Stage 4, complete with dolphins. I wonder how Echo the Dolphin feels about this. It all looks so amazing, and it goes right with that Rockstar Sega experimental vibe, even if the frame rate isn't always completely consistent. But beyond the wacky graphics and rapid-paced gameplay could be the best part, the amazing house music soundtrack. I'm a big fan of electronic music, and Zaxxon's Motherbase 2000 has some banging tunes. There are games that when you hear the music, you get so excited to play, and then there are ones like Zaxxon that just get you amped. Every track in this game is stellar. Dare I say it's one of my favorite soundtracks of all time? But yeah, unfortunately, the difficulty and the somewhat brutal level design can be a detriment for some, but seriously, if you haven't given Zaxxon's Motherbase 2000 a chance, give it a chance. It got ripped apart by reviewers back in the day, and to me, that's so unfair, because I had a fantastic time with it. Sure, it has issues, but it became a personal favorite of mine on the 32X. The name addition may have been useless, but the game is far from that. Truly underrated and a fantastic way to cap off the 32X library. 4 Gs out of 5. And there you go. That's the 32X library. Between these two videos, we've now covered everything, and you've seen what the Growing Up Genesis A to Z has to offer. So, if you have not yet, leave a like, comment, and tell me what you think about the series, and subscribe so you can know when the full Sega Genesis A to Z library is starting to begin on YouTube. I'm going to have it up very, very soon for you all, so keep your eyes peeled. And as always, be you and be awesome. I'm G, and I'll see you on the next level.